today, as we speak, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, has gone to the United Nations asking for so-called snapback sanctions against Iran. Let's start with Iran. How would President Biden, we think, if there were a President Biden, differ from President Trump in his approach to Iran?
It's pretty clear that the Biden administration, if it came to being, would immediately try to restart the JCPOA, the old Iranian nuclear deal. I don't think it would happen quickly, in part because that deal didn't get the Iranians, after their assets were unfrozen, the kind of foreign investment they had hoped for, and because the supreme leader wouldn't want to give the Iranian president an immediate win, especially in the run-up to Iranian elections. But the relationship would improve, and I do think you would get easy multilateral engagement between a Biden administration and the U.S. allies that helped to put that initial Iranian deal in place. And you know, David, that just a few days ago, when the Trump administration brought a furthering of an arms embargo against Iran to a vote at the Security Council, it didn't even require a veto. It was 11-2 against the United States, quite an embarrassment for the Trump administration. Yeah,
at the same time, wouldn't it be awfully difficult to get that genie back in the bottle? I mean, years have passed. There was a clock ticking throughout in the length of the curtailment of their development. And in the meantime, they've been really enriching uranium in Iran. Can we really just go back to status quo ante?
You know, I'm someone who believed that the deal was a good deal for what it's worth, David, but it was a limited deal. It didn't stop the Iranians from supporting Hezbollah and other organizations we consider as Americans terrorist organizations in the region. Didn't stop them from developing ballistic missile technologies and testing those missiles, which was in breach of United Nations Security Council resolutions. And it didn't open trade or diplomacy between the United States and Iran. So, I mean, it was a deal, but it was a limited deal. And so if you ask me, could we get that back? I want to make sure everyone understands that doesn't suddenly mean that the United States and Iran are going to be friends in any way, shape, or form. America's closest allies in the region will still be countries like the United States, the UAE, and the Gulf states, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. And by the way, those countries are a lot closer today diplomatically to each other than they were under the Obama administration, in part because they all see Iran as their common principal enemy. And again, even though Biden would want to come back to the old deal, Biden would also see Iran as our principal antagonist in the region as well.
So let's go to a different hotspot that'll be in the inbox for the next president, whether that's Donald Trump for a second term or a Joe Biden, and that is Belarus and our relationship with Russia. It seems to me, at least, that President Putin has got a bit of a problem there.
He does. And, you know, what's interesting about Belarus is that the people of the country are not particularly anti-Russian. There was the most recent poll that was taken on this nationwide was back in December, but over 90% of Belarusians at the time had a generally favorable orientation towards Russia. You wouldn't find that in Ukraine, and you wouldn't have before the Orange Revolution. So, I mean, there's enormous outcry against Lukashenko. They want him out. And if the Russians intervene, they're going to be mad at Russia, too. And we're already seeing the Russians start to intervene. For example, Belarusian state television, which was off the air because the existing anchors refused to cover a propagandistic support of Lukashenko. They wanted to cover the demonstrators. Well, now Belarus state television is covering the regime. And apparently Russians have come in, provided by the Russian government, to allow that. So they are engaged on the ground. They're not engaged militarily. And there aren't great outcomes for Putin here. He'd rather this just continue to be a comfortable dictatorship aligned very strongly with Russia. But what's interesting, you're asking me about Biden. The fact is that the Putin administration understands that as long as Trump is in place, there's not going to be significant U.S. outcry against Russian intervention in Crimea or Southeast Ukraine. I mean, Trump has on many occasions said, why can't we just forget about Crimea. They already took it. It's not my problem. I mean, I have a hard time seeing Trump standing up for democracy in Belarus, Trump standing up against the Kremlin. You've also seen that Navalny, the most important opposition member in Russia, today is in a coma because he was poisoned, one would presume, by the Russian government. And, not something we see a lot, unfortunately, from Russia, but the timing here is unfortunate and certainly coincidental. You have to wonder, is the Kremlin trying to create facts on the ground while they know Trump is still there? Because life would get more difficult for the Russians in a Biden administration.
So, Ian, that's Iran, that's Russia. Let's get to the really big one, I think, on the agenda for whoever's in the White House in the next 4 years, and that is China, U.S.-China relations. You think, actually, this is something of a success, as I understand it, President Trump's foreign policy relationship with China?
Yeah, in the sense that pretty much everyone, Democrat and Republican, agree that the United States needs to take a tougher policy, a tougher stance against China. They were involved in a serious cover-up of the coronavirus for the first weeks when they didn't tell their own people, never mind the World Health Organization or the rest of the world. That made this pandemic a lot worse. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese from Wuhan leaving the country during that period of time. Biden's mad about that. Trump's mad about that. They are trying to become a tech superpower, to have a lot more access and control over data of people outside China and competing with American tech companies. Both Trump and Biden would want to fight back against that. The Chinese have unilaterally changed the rule set. There's no more one state, two systems with Hong Kong. The entire Western world opposes China doing that. That would be true for both Trump and for Biden. So, I mean, really, what you see, I think, in the next few months will be both the president and the former vice president competing to show that each are tougher against this Chinese government. And I think that if Biden came in, you'd certainly see a stronger effort to make U.S. policy more assertively multilateral, use our allies and make statements together where, Trump's orientation is more unilateral and forcing allies to get on board with the Americans as opposed to constructing policy together. But I think the broad sweeping strokes of those policies towards China actually wouldn't change very much between these two leaders.
So not a potentially big difference, at least on the substance of the position. And we've heard Republicans this week say you don't hear about China at the Democratic Convention, in part because they really don't disagree with us on it at all. At the same point, is this sort of fundamental as a different approach, particularly in the tech world, particularly to the internet, where there's this term now, I've read, net nationalism. The internet was thought to be open to all, a way of communicating with all. Some countries, led apparently by China, want to use it as an instrument of state power.
That's very clear. And, we used to talk about a World Wide Web. I mean, that sounds quaint today. There is no such thing. The Chinese have a separate internet and increasingly a separate Internet of Things that works for their own people, and also that they are starting to export to countries like Zimbabwe, for example, Pakistan, mostly poorer countries that have benefited from Chinese investment and loans. But the advanced industrial democracies are almost all aligned with the American tech firms. And so we can talk about net nationalism, David, but the reality is there are only two countries in the world that have global technology firms, truly of scale, and that's the United States and China. And so I think it's more accurate to talk about a technology Cold War, which we are presently in. The Chinese do not allow American tech firms like Facebook or like Google or like Amazon to function openly in the Chinese market, the largest data market in the world. And the United States has now making it clear that Huawei and very soon TikTok and WeChat will not be operating in the United States. And by the way, we don't want them operating with our allies either. And if they do operate with our allies, we intend to make that costly. Both in terms of intelligence sharing and perhaps economic sanctions as well to those countries. Once again, I think that policy would be almost completely in substance upheld if we were to see a Biden administration come into place next year.
So, Ian, here in closing, when you talk about a tech Cold War, ultimately, I think it's fair to say the West and the United States won that original Cold War against the Soviet Union, in large part because we had more resources. Can we win a tech Cold War, given the fact that China is growing so fast and is going to eclipse us at some point here as a worldwide economy?
You know, David, we had more resources, but also our ideas were better. I mean, ultimately, the Soviet Union and the East Bloc imploded from within because their ideology was bankrupt and because we were seen as leading by example. Now, I think if it's purely a tech Cold War between the U.S. and China, I'm not sure whose technology is ultimately going to end up being more effective. I know a lot of the top experts in this field, and they're not sure. If it's mostly about scientists, it's probably the Americans. If it's mostly about data, it's probably the Chinese. And there's a big debate going on in that front. Where we are winning is on ideas. Our allies, even though they don't like Trump, do understand that rule of law and a comparatively free market in the United States is a lot better to align yourself with than a state capitalist and authoritarian China. And even though the United States right now is doing our damnedest to shoot ourselves in the foot on those fronts, and we're not feeling like we're leading by example very much. I mean, it's pretty obvious. If you're Australia, if you're Japan, if you're Canada, if you're France, if you're Germany, if you're the UK, and you're forced to choose between the United States and China, you'd say, well, no, I don't want to have to. I don't. But if you're forced to choose, you know who you're choosing.
It's fascinating.